Great, thank you. Is it on? Right, so Divided US Society is the title of the session. Do we still live in the United States of America, or are we in the divided states of America? That's the question for the session. And apropos of this session, the #1 box office hit last weekend was Civil War, a dystopian thriller about the divided US. And I'm at Stanford University, and the university campus is deeply divided on various issues, especially on the Middle East. Everything we do is political. University presidents are losing their jobs. I think Columbia University president sustained herself yesterday. So we live in a very difficult time, and we have a distinguished panelists to talk about these issues. So just because this is a year of election, there are a lot of important elections happening, culminating in the November election here in the United States. If you have to bet today on the outcome of the election, Trump or Biden, how many of you would vote for, not vote for, bet on Biden right now? That's pretty good. Trump? Oh, that's pretty good. Oh, okay. That's encouraging. I'm not going to ask you all about your predictions, but let us get started with that election in November, because that's the giant elephant and donkey in the room. So let's start with Rachel. Hello, Rachel. Hi. So what should we be prepared for on the day after, November 6th? After the election? I guess it depends on who wins, but do we see more peaceful? If there's transitional power, do we see it more peacefully? If Biden wins, what do we expect? Another post-election violence or something a little bit different? I know you have some thoughts on that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So sadly, I couldn't see the room. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I've been traveling far too much for my 2 young children. But I couldn't see the room, but I think it's really a toss-up, and it's very, very close, far too close to call. So first of all, the day after the election, we will have no idea what happened, most likely, because there's a couple of key states like Pennsylvania, where right now, at least, they can't start counting their ballots until later, and so there will be a delay. We can imagine that during that delay, both sides are going to get quite antsy. It was predicted in 2020 that we would have a blue wave, a kind of initial red outpouring of votes, and then more blue votes coming in later because Democrats were more likely to vote absentee. We're likely to see something similar this time, although some states have tightened their absentee laws. So more red votes right away because people are very, very skeptical of voting at all and more skeptical about voting in person on the right, and more blue votes coming in later. Regardless of who wins, I think you're going to have people on both sides who are very distrustful of the findings. Even if Trump wins, he's very likely to say that it wasn't by the right amount. You have about 70% of Republicans right now saying that they don't trust elections quite deeply. The other 30% do trust elections in terms of them not being rigged, but basically think that the whole structure is against them to some extent. You have very few people who really deeply believe in the structure. But on the left, what you're getting, as you alluded to at Stanford, is also a greater normalization of violence for political ends and a greater sense that the stakes are so high that we're up against autocracy and that all means are on the table. And so I think, especially if the Senate is also up for grabs, so that some things like classified briefings and so on can't start because we don't have a full Senate, we're likely to see protests on both sides. Those protests are likely to be armed on the right, but possibly also violent on the left, with some property crime more than people crime. But property crime, especially at night, that'll give the right more excuses. And so the quicker we get the election solved, the better. But I'm expecting some real turmoil after November and before January.
Thank you. And staying on the theme of dystopian future, what are some of the, and we're going to get back to the role of media as a bigger question, but I know you're thinking about the impact of some disinformation campaigns coming from outside or within and the issue of trust in the political institutions. From your perspective, Marcus, could you comment on some of the potential issues? And Ken, Suzuki-san, maybe you have some ideas about worst case scenario that could happen, both of you. Can you talk about those issues?
Yeah, I assume this works. I think, well, first of all, let me just go, I want to just rewind a little bit back to the question around what happens on the day after the election. And I will say, in 2016, there were a lot of people in America who didn't imagine that Hillary Clinton could lose. And so when they woke up or when they went to bed and they had realized that Donald Trump won, many liberals were feeling both bitter and unhappy that Donald Trump had won and also feeling embarrassed that they'd got prediction wrong. So I think a lot of people this year are making the prediction that Trump is going to win, just so if Trump should win, they'll at least feel good about that. And this is, but I'm only half joking. I think it's way too early for anybody to make predictions, because I think it really is, as was said, far too close to know. And at this point, you know, there are so many variables, from the age and health of the candidates, both virile young men, as you know, and foreign policy issues, which are deeply problematic around the world. So I don't think anybody has any clue. However, layered on top of that, and I think this is what we're getting at here, there is a giant problem of trust in the US. And, you know, in 2016, there were a lot of deeply detailed and credible accounts of Russian attempts to manipulate public opinion in the US. There's been attempts to suggest that that wasn't really going on. It was going on. It's not clear that it actually affected the outcome as much as some people would have you believe. But what it did is it gave a signal to people. It was a sort of early precursor of what's to come, which is now many groups use technology to promote, let's say, distortions or lies, or things that might exploit and accentuate fissures in American society. And a key part of this is to create a lack of trust, to make people doubt their institutions. And the delegitimization of US institutions has been going on for some time. Some people take it all the way back to Newt Gingrich in 1994 when he was Speaker of the House, and he started tearing down institutions in order to gain control of them. And the delegitimization of institutions in the US, which started in the political sphere and now has extended out into, you know, media has been well discredited for a long time, but during the pandemic, it was, you know, the medical profession was being discredited, science was being attacked, the elites were being attacked. It reminds me of my time in China, you know, when people talked about the Cultural Revolution and it was better to be read than expert. You know, we live in a time when it is better to be, you have to be aligned with your party, tribe before truth. And that, the uncertainty and the doubt is what leads to these numbers Rachel was giving us about, you know, people not trusting, already telling us they're not going to trust the outcome. And so I think we have a very grave problem in this country of getting people aligned. And you know, one of the things we should probably talk about is how do you get people's faith in the election and its integrity, or how do you get people's faith in the system or in the economy back to where we can function as a democracy?
Yeah, I'm not an expert of the US politics like so Rachel and Marcus, and I'm not an American. But as a foreigner, so I traveled around more than 25 states in these 8 years. So I'd like to bridge the gap. So you're maybe maybe 60% of the audience of this session is Japanese. So I want to explain the gap of the context of Japan and the US. So, so last election in 2020, so I traveled to Miami to see the election date. And then just after that, I flew to Las Vegas to see the Stop the Steal movement. And then, so there were many people surrounding the vote counting station, and some of them actually are activists with guns, and some of them are families with children. And then, after 2 months later, as you know, the Capitol Hill attack occurred. So, so I can imagine that more severe situation would happen this year. So the worst scenario in my mind is the day before the election date. So many Gen AI generated content will spread out on social media. And then, so those content may be created by the foreign powers. So their intention is not to control the result. So the problem is, regardless of the winner, if the credibility of the US election is damaged, so if the people cannot believe the trust to the election result, this is the purpose of the attackers.
Let's stay on this topic, and three of us here conspired, Rachel, to direct all the tough questions to you. So I have two here. Building on what Marcus said about the building trust and foreign interference possibilities, do you see the threat of whoever, there are foreign leaders salivating for Trump 2.0, especially Putin, perhaps Kim Jong-un, definitely Benjamin Netanyahu. So what do you see in terms of the threat of foreign interference meddling in misinformation campaigns? And the second question, building on Ken Suzuki-san's point, what is the mobilizing capacity of Trump these days, especially inciting people to violence? In your estimation, does he still have the same kind of capacity to bring people to do something like January 6th?
Great questions. So I think on foreign interference, Marcus is exactly right. We're pretty sure that Russia did attempt quite a lot in 2016, but probably there was very little uptake when you look at who saw the posts. We are now in a very different situation. You have Republicans on the floor of the House accusing members of their own party of taking up and repeating Russian propaganda. It's quite widespread already, and it's not just Russia. We have Iranian and Chinese and so on. So the information attacks and so on are different. They're not all about let's elect Trump or let's elect Biden. They tend to be fairly suppressive toward Black voters, just don't come out. Also young voters, don't bother, it's not worth it. They tend to be more mobilizing towards certain other voter segments. But a lot of it, as was said, is really about creating distrust, creating chaos, creating enough of a question about what's going on and who's behind it. But we're seeing a decent amount of it right now over Ukraine and so on. In terms of sort of direct interference, like fooling around with voter rolls, that seems less likely, but we are less prepared in a certain way. We do have preparations, but there's less ability right now for the platforms to speak to government and for government to get information from outside sources because of a series of court cases that have taken place around issues of free speech since 2020. Now, in terms of Trump's capacity to mobilize for violence, this is very different this year. So if the information warfare situation is worse, the actual warfare situation is probably a little bit better. First of all, around the world, you generally see the most common election violence is when an incumbent thinks he's going to lose and doesn't want to leave office. And that's because the incumbent controls the security services, and that gives often the security services license to be violent, but it also gives vigilantes license to be violent with the thought that they won't be attacked by the security services. That was much more the situation we had on January 6th, although of course the law enforcement did not defect and they did do the right thing by our republic. That wasn't a certainty for those people who were on the other side of that. Today, what we've seen is that the people who follow Trump are much less willing to come out en masse for him. He's called for them to do so in New York at the beginning of his whole civil trial situation, not the sort of the trial, but when he was first indicted and they wouldn't come out. And he's called a couple other times. He hasn't been able to mobilize. And part of that is because people are feeling a little burned that he didn't bail out or pardon the January 6th defendants or pay their legal fees, and he has since promised to do so in the hopes that he can get more people on his side. People are afraid of FBI and so on. But just because he isn't able to pull people out on the streets now doesn't mean he won't be able to at the end of a campaign season. People organize over time, and so now is very different than the end of a campaign. Also, what he has been able to do is use what's known as stochastic terrorism, which is when someone with a huge following says, I would love to target this person or this institution. They're not necessarily directly calling for violence, and they don't know who's going to commit it. They're not hiring someone to do it, but they can be pretty sure that among their followers, because the group is so large, that someone will. And we're seeing that very clearly, this call and response where Trump will say something against a political rival or a judge or a witness in a case, and very quickly they'll be swatted where someone calls the police to a fake address, hoping that the police might fire first, or they get doxxed with their name put out on the internet so that people can show up at their house and threaten them or what have you. So we're seeing that very frequently. And while it's much more one-on-one than the kind of mass violence, it doesn't speak well for where we might be around election time.
Thank you. Do you have something to follow up on?
Well, I'm reminded there's a great Shakespeare line, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" The king says, and then the priest is gotten rid of. And this is, this kind of incitement to violence. I will say on those points, I agree with everything she said, and I would add, I think in some ways, if Trump wins, there is more risk in the longer term of violence because Trump will undoubtedly pardon the January 6 offenders he calls the January 6 hostages, and will do everything he can to decriminalize the behavior that they engaged in before. So I think that becomes a problem going forward, whereas I think if Biden wins, that element doesn't come into play.
Thank you. I've been teaching a course on international human rights for a couple decades, and I used to talk about post-election violence in Kenya, Ivory Coast, and so on. And these days, we have to really worry about something happening in anticipation of American elections. That's kind of amazing, the kind of world we live in. And I'm old enough to remember the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore, and also the Iraq War and the division that existed in this country. But somehow, the political division that we're experiencing today feels a little bit different. And maybe can you, either Rachel or Marcus, or Ken-san, contextualize the division that we're experiencing today in the sort of long history of the United States? There was a civil war, right? Where does it rank in terms of the divisiveness of the country? Maybe Rachel?
Sure. So my colleague Jennifer McCoy, who teaches at Georgia, has a term for this, which is called pernicious polarization. So Americans are actually not very ideologically divided, not nearly as much as we think we are, at least. We have a lot of overlap, even on the toughest issues, immigration and guns and so on. We really dislike each other. So the numbers of affective polarization, people just disliking each other across party, is much higher than ever before. But that masks the fact that we're much less racially divided than ever before. So while some divisions, our partisan divisions, are getting worse and they map onto some racial divisions, others, like those racial divisions, are actually getting better than they've ever been. But what pernicious polarization is about is when the political parties have an incentive to further divide. And so what you get is a feedback loop where political partisans are divided. Their politicians that they're electing further divide them in order to gain more power, and on it goes. And that is the situation we're in now. And it's because of a couple of structural changes. First, we have first past the post winner take all elections, which means that if you get one more vote and it's the decisive vote, you get the whole entity, whether it's a congressional seat or a senatorial seat or what have you. Those types of systems globally are much more willing to have election suppression, voter suppression, violence, because of course the stakes for each voter are much higher than in a proportional system where you get 1% more, you get 1% more on your list. So we have that structure. Atop that, we have a very, very divided Congress. We haven't had a Congress that's this likely to go back and forth in power since Reconstruction. That's Frances Lee's work. She's an excellent scholar. And usually our Congress is held by one party for decades at a time. Now it's very, very tight. And what that means is the incentive to push on any given election a little is high anyway, but it's really high if one or two elections might make the difference between controlling Congress or controlling the presidency, as it is because we're so evenly divided. And that's exacerbated by the fact that we now have a vast majority of seats that are safe. Over 85% of our congressional seats are going to be won already, we know, by one party or the other. They're not going to change hands. We have very few seats likely to change hands between parties. That means that your best strategy for winning is, first of all, to go to your right and left in the primary, but also to just work on a get out the vote strategy. So you're just trying to get your people out. You're not really trying to persuade anyone else. And that leads to all these incentives for polarization. And so that's where we are right now. And it's just pernicious, as Jennifer says, because it's a very difficult structure to break. We might need to change some of these electoral structures, which we've done before. We've changed our primary structure. We've had things like ranked choice voting and primary reform, but it's hard to see with a party that's incentivized to polarize how you break out of this.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert of the political history, but I think maybe the division of the United States is the worst in this last 50 years. But it is not the worst in the 240-year history of the United States. So the last civil war in the US was from 1861 to 1865. And do you know the last civil war in Japan? So it was so in Japan known as the Seinan War, and was started by Saigo Takamori in 1877, and so 25 years later from the civil war in the US. So I'd like to explain the difference between the civil war in the US and the current division in the US. So what makes today's division in the US different from the civil war is that slavery was a major issue at that time. So the division between slave states and the free states was clear because each state had different opinions about it. In comparison, the division this time is not state-by-state conflict, but more like a county-by-county conflict. So even liberal states like California, if you go to the rural area, there are so many red counties. And even red states like Texas, if you go to Austin and Dallas and Houston, they are all blue counties. So those are mainly the division is a rural area versus urban area. So I did my own county-by-county analysis of swing states, and shortly after the election 2016, the shift of the vote from Democrats in 2012, which Obama won, to Republican in the 2016 election, which Trump won, occurred at the smaller population counties in a rural area. The vote shifts are not happening in the large urban counties. So in that sense, in short, this is not a state by state, more like a county by county, especially in terms of the size of the population.
I'm going to just draw on my background as a journalist to talk a little bit about the fragmentation in the US, because I think it's true we have polarization, and we have in Rachel an expert who can talk about this, but there is a larger issue happening in the US political system, which is fragmentation into smaller and smaller groups, sort of sub-party fragmentation. And I associate it, and maybe this is just from my perspective, with the change in media and how the model of media and journalism, what works economically in media. So in the early days of the United States, when our society was deeply fragmented and there were, the political parties were extremely hostile to each other, newspapers were basically printed one sheet at a time. They had very limited distribution. They tended to serve one particular group within one party. So those of you who know the early history of the United States will know that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were bitter rivals, and they each had these newspapers that attacked each other constantly, full of lies and distortions, misrepresentations. And the reason that those newspapers delivered the news that way is because you could only print a certain number of papers because you were doing it one sheet at a time. There's a great book about American history called Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin about the administration of Abraham Lincoln. And there's one section in there about how William Seward leaves the town of Auburn, New York, population 30,000, and all 11 newspapers wish him well. The idea that there were 11 daily newspapers, or 11 newspapers, maybe not daily, but 11 newspapers in one small town is because they were being printed one at a time. They were serving small communities. By the late 19th century, printing presses were accelerating. They were faster and faster, and newspapers were serving larger and larger audiences. It was an advertising model. They wanted to have more people reading the newspaper because you sold the newspapers in a 1 penny per sheet. And so they went to tabloids. There's a famous William Randolph Hearst newspaper proprietor who loved tabloid newspapers, sensational headlines. He's the guy who said to his journalist, who went off to Cuba, who said, like, "There's no war there, boss." He said, "Look, you give me the pictures, I'll give you the war." It was sell as many newspapers as you can. And as they grew, as they became sort of monopolies, everybody in this room, whether you're in Japan or the US, you grew up in a world where there were a handful of newspapers, a handful of television stations. It was at best an oligopoly. In most towns, most small towns, there was one newspaper. In the US, there were 3 television stations that were licensed by the government. And the goal was to have the biggest audience you could, so you didn't want to offend anybody. So you did a little sports news, a little international news, a little cooking news, and that model was the model most of us grew up with, and it led to very centralized narratives, sort of common understanding of the world. And there was no particular incentive to go off in your own corner and create your own understanding of the world. That changed, first with cable TV actually, not with the internet, because cable TV allowed you to have multiple channels. And Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes in this country started Fox News on the right because they knew they could peel off some segment of the audience and deliver the world to them as they wanted to see it, and it worked. And then the internet comes along, and the internet is hyper-fragmentation, right? So there's all these little channels, and they're serving specific interests, specific ideological alignments, specific, if you like wine, you can read a wine newsletter. If you like skiing, you can read a skiing thing. And so what's happened is our society has become increasingly fragmented. There's no sort of common narrative and common understanding. And the technology platforms reward engagement. So they reward you for whatever gets people most excited. And so if you're delivering content that is sort of middle of the road, everybody can agree on this, even-handed content, it doesn't create any economic incentive for you. If you do something highly inflammatory that gets people super exercised, or it fits with some conspiracy narrative, people get engaged, you can monetize it. And so I think this has led to a fragmentation of our society. And I don't want to take too much responsibility for journalism or too much time with this answer, but I think that you cannot separate what's happened in the information environment with what's happened in the political environment. And I actually think, I'm not sure what's causal, maybe Rachel has a theory on it, but they're definitely tied closely together.
Thank you. Let's stay on the impact of media in that regard, and especially social media, because often social media are vilified as at least an enabler of this deep division that we're observing. And when social media or internet and social media started, there was the Arab Spring, right, and Occupy Wall Street. And those media were seen to be more enablers of democracy, democratization, and popular uprising social movements. But somehow today, social media are seen as more villains in the world of politically divided world. So what aspects of social media in particular are problematic in your views? And you touched on the extreme opinions winning in the marketplace of different views because they get more likes and more attention, and there's definitely incentive to put out the most extreme kind of views out there. There's also an aspect of how social media empower populist demagogues to directly reach their audience. There's no filters of CNNs or Washington Post and so on. There's also this algorithm aspect of how you view a certain kind of news media clips, then you get more of those same ideological orientations type of media. So what are, in your views, what aspects of the social media are particularly problematic in deepening political divisions? Ken-san, you have right.
Yeah, before the election 2016, there was a significant political division, even in Obama administration era, or even before. And this political division started from maybe late 1990s, and then it's become larger and larger during these 20 years. And then, but actually, the social media accelerated this political division, maybe just around maybe 2016, from the 2016. And then I would say, but the actual result at the swing states of the election campaign result at swing states didn't so affected by the social media, I think. Most of those people in a rural area watch the CNN or Fox News and those cable TV media, not social media, because mobile was not so effective in 2016. But after that, so as you know, the most important issue is in social media is conspiracy theory, and as you know, like a QAnon, and and then this QAnon it spread in the social media and called 4channel. So have you heard about it? So 4channel is inspired by the Japanese social media called 2channel, and then actually this 4channel and is evolved into 8channel or 8kun, and then that spread the conspiracy theory in the election 2020, and then that will affect the, I think maybe Stop the Steal movement. So, but still, this service is operated by Japanese company and the Japanese owner called Hiroyuki. So this is not the problem of the U.S. Problem. This is a global problem. And have you anyone watch the anti-social network, which was published on Netflix last week? No? Okay. Please watch this new content on Netflix, the anti-social network. This is amazing documentary that shows how also 2channel, 4channel, 8channel will evolved. Actually evolved in this 20 years and affected their conspiracy theory. And then, the problem is this service is managed by Japanese company. I think maybe the U.S. and Japan need to countermeasure this problem jointly.
Rachel, do you have anything to add in terms of the role of media? And what would you ask, these are some of the most influential media content creators, distributors sitting here. What would you want to ask them to do to moderate political divisions in the United States?
Sure. So first of all, I agree with everything that's been said. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with such wise co-panelists. Marcus pointed out that algorithms amplify extremes, and you pointed the same thing out, that there are no filters, and so you can go direct to the people. Those two things both make people misperceive the other sides. They perceive the other side as really much worse than they are because they're hearing from the extremes. But it also is just getting a lot of people to tune out. We have a large number of people in America who are actually choosing not to consume any news, or at least any political news, because they're so tired of this. Then there's the political structure I described. You need a leader to exploit this. If you just had that, but your leaders were normal, you wouldn't get such a problem. And actually, we're seeing that in a number of European countries, that they also are using the internet. It has the same algorithms. They're using social media, but it's not having the same effects on their democracy because they don't have this particular political structure that we have. But places that do, Venezuela under Chavez, or in America with Trump, are having worse problems. But there's two other things I'd want to mention. One is the demise of local news. That when we had a strong local news sector, it really helped to give people a buffer against all this craziness. You might see the craziness, but then you would go back to your local newspaper or local TV and see things were pretty normal, and you would take it with a grain of salt. But with local news just collapsing across the United States, this sort of activity set gets many more eyes and is much more believable. And then the second other trend is we have much less real life connectivity across difference. The trends that were mentioned in Bowling Alone by Putnam 20 some years ago have only amplified since then. And so you're hearing this craziness on social media. It's being amplified by politicians and leaders. You don't have any local news to buffer yourself against it. And you can't just go out to your local union hall or your library or your school and see people who are very different than you and be reassured that they're not dragons with tails and horns, because you just don't have those connections anymore. We're very geographically sorted, and people are going out a lot less. So I think all four of those things are playing a role together. And in terms of what folks in the room could do, I mean, Japanese media, as Ken-san was just saying, incredibly important. We're in really one global media environment in many ways. And so that moderation is hard. And probably the best thing that we know from the research is that kicking people off mainstream channels can actually lead to them becoming more radicalized. So it's usually better to just to rate them down, just to have fewer people see their posts rather than kicking them off altogether. That would require a whole nother monetization strategy, because if you're not going to make your money off anger and excitement, where is it going to come? And will TikTok just eat your lunch? I'm not sure what to do about that. I'm not a business person for a reason. But the other thing that I think business could do, and I'll end with this, is Japanese business could let US business know that they're worried, that this isn't just business as usual. We heard Jamie Dimon at Davos say, oh, things will be pretty much the same. But we as experts in populism know that actually that's not the case. Businesses are really harmed by populist leaders. There's a lot more stock market volatility, a lot more whimsical, personalized decision making. And for Japanese business to tell their peers that they're concerned would probably be a useful thing.
Yeah, just on a couple of points to add to that. The absence of local news is a problem in part because all the things we were talking about before, the sort of fake news and efforts to cause distrust, they're all filtering down to the local level, and there is no local news. And obviously, in the absence of local news, people get caught up in the national narratives. And there was a famous American politician, Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House, used to say all politics is local. Well, in fact, weirdly, today we live in a time where all news is national. People get caught up in what the national narratives are. I will give you a little reassurance before I talk about the social media companies, that the media companies that we most vilify, like Fox News or MSNBC, depending on your perspective, the one being on the right, the other being on the left, and some will object to my putting them in the same sentence, but never mind. They have very small audiences relative to the US population. The average audience of Fox News, average audience, it goes higher, it goes lower, is 1.2 million. It's not huge. Broadcast television in the US, the three legacy channels, still reach 35 million people with their broadcast news in the evening or the morning. So, and they're not seen as right or left. In fact, that's one of the things that gives me some confidence that Americans are getting good information is we, the media and the academics, we focus in on the problems and the sources of trouble, and we should, I think. But I also think a lot of Americans are, in fact, getting reasonably good information still about national events. But then the problem is you have these, again, back to the fragments, the extremes on the right and the left who are often these conspiracy zones. I want to talk about the social media platforms if I can just for 1 second. The social media platforms in America have been uniquely and historically irresponsible in the way they've engaged with society. Consistently, and the only possible reading of it, no matter what they may say, is it's economic. And I'll explain it like this. To take Meta as an example, and Meta's got enormous talented people doing a lot of really amazing great things, and their products have changed the world for good in many ways. But they continue to distribute information over their various platforms that they know and is easily knowable to be false. If you went to American newspapers, television, or radio stations 25 years ago, and you wanted to put an ad in any of them that contained information promoting a fraudulent product or a political advertisement full of lies, your advertisement would have been rejected. Local newspaper, local radio, national newspaper, national TV would have been rejected. The platforms today in the US have these self-serve advertising platforms, and they take this stuff. If it's products, they put up fraudulent products. I've been on Instagram, I bought some really cool Maui Jim sunglasses that arrived wrapped in brown paper from Chengdu. They weren't actually Maui Jim sunglasses, but they were cheap. The kinds of content that are being distributed, political content, advertising, both Google and Meta, or Alphabet and Meta, both said that in this election year, they're not going to block political advertising that contains lies, because who are they to get between the voters and their political leaders? Even though historically that's what the media in this country did. It blocked that stuff from going out. When you look at Meta's gross and net profit margins, Meta 2 years ago was about the same size as General Motors in terms of revenues. Meta's net profit margin was about 40%, maybe higher. GM's profit margin, net margin, was about 7%. Now, if GM made cars with no brake lights, no steering wheels, no airbags, no speed regulators, they could make more money, but their products would kill people. And my concern about the social media companies is when they say that they spend billions moderating, fine. They're not spending billions enough to be responsible participants in a democracy.
Yeah, I want to add a comment. But also we need a certain regulation to the social media, but it's very hard to make a strong regulation by the government, because as you know, there is a First Amendment, the Constitution, and freedom of speech is a very important philosophy for the U.S. So in that sense, the definition of fake news is very difficult in this divided situation. So I think my idea is making a kind of third-party organization to do the audit process, like accounting audit, and the board of directors need to oversee those kind of audit process, and then so the government cannot regulate the platform directly, but maybe by using the third party and the governance structure, maybe we can manage a kind of the co-regulatory system. That's my idea.
This issue of Meta not willing to pull down false information is playing a big role in Japan, as some of you know, these deceptive ad campaigns that are becoming a big issue in Japan. We have to move to Q&A, but I want to ask you one quick question. What would be, Rachel has already mentioned a couple of these issues, but what would be, if there's one change you can make in the election rules in the United States, what would it be? Like 15 seconds each, please. Rachel?
I'd adopt a system like Alaska. The places that have adopted systems like that no primary, instant runoff. You have 4 or 5 choices to pick from. That's where our most moderate Republicans and also Democrats are coming from, places like Louisiana at the gubernatorial level, and Maine and Alaska.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcus.
As they say in Congress, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of my colleague.
The same as Rachel.
So no ranked choice voting or anything like that? Okay, so the primaries are the biggest problem. Okay, great.
They're connected. These are get rid of primaries and you have a ranked choice. It's called instant runoff, but yeah.
Great. Thank you. Now we're going to open the floor for questions. We're going to take in batches of 2 or 3. So anybody?
Thank you. My question is about what Kenson just said about the what do you call this, monitoring of different media, whether they're valid or not, and for that, instead of that becoming censorship of some sort, if there's a neutral mechanism, that's a great thing. But I was curious that you're talking about, let's say, Fox News's reach being small relative to the major networks, right? So would something like a showing the viewership or reach of each media or specific subject matters, would that help people kind of make better judgment about what they're consuming in terms of news?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. After next 4 years or 8 years, that means after the generational change of presidents, the situation will be more improved. Do you have any positive vision or negative vision about division?
I guess we'll start with those 2 questions.
Well, I can on the issue of disclosing the reach. It's an interesting idea. I'd never thought of it. If people knew that they were reading something that was like this little cul-de-sac of information, because a lot of people live in these, that's another thing that our friends in the social media companies have done, is they've created algorithms that once somebody expresses an interest in QAnon, then pretty soon it's recommending more content in QAnon. They end up living in these little cul-de-sacs of information where they never see any other information except information that's being fed to them based on their interests. If they knew that they were reading stuff that was really very narrowly directed to them, would it change how they thought about it? It's a really interesting question because, it's like fashion. People don't want to wear the, quirky fashion unless everybody else is wearing the quirky fashion, then pretty soon they're all wearing it. So I've never thought of that, and I'd have to think about it. There is as you probably know, there are these platforms and Smart News is, I'm sure you probably even use NewsGuard and things like this. There are these platforms that rate the quality of information brand by brand. There's not anything at the moment, maybe AI will change this, there's nothing that rates the quality of news or accuracy of news article by article. It's a complicated, hard thing to do. Although I actually think AI is going to be both terrible for fake news and directing people to, it's going to just supercharge all the problems, but it also has the potential to start solving problems. I was talking to this guy yesterday, his name's Astro Teller, his real name is not Astro, but he runs Google X. He thinks that there's going to be what he calls, it's like an edge computing solution. Everybody is going to have, his theory of the case is, we are all going to have an AI assistant that's going to filter stuff coming into us, know what it's going to tell us as it's coming in. This is reputable, this is not reputable, this fits with something else you read. I hope he's right. I think that, it's easy to paint, we've been sitting up here painting a really dark picture of what's happening in the world. We should probably spend at least a couple minutes painting a brighter picture, because maybe AI is not the end of the world. Maybe AI is actually going to give us some solutions to some of these really deep chronic problems.
The good news is, so American people is getting tired of this political division. According to the Pew Research Center last year, so 57% of American people think that current political too much current attention by the media to the politician is too much, and then more than 80% of American people think that the more important issues get less attention, so a little. So in that sense, so I think maybe this is the good news that maybe people want to know more important issues than the political division itself. And so by using AI, so we can figure out not the differences of the two sides, but more like what's the common ground of the two sides. I think maybe, and by using the AI, we can figure out what's the common ground. And that's maybe future.
Rachel, perhaps on the issue of generational changes, which might change the
Sure.
dynamic? Yeah.
I mean, certainly we need generational change. It's ridiculous that in a country of over 300 million people, we have the same few running for office over and over into their 80s. But I think in terms of it changing, if it changes to Gen X, so these are the sort of next generation leaders, there's a slew of really solid next generation leaders. You know, everyone from a Jeff Flake or his cohorts on the right to Jared Polis and Hickenlooper and all sorts of folks on the left. And Gen X is known to be a fairly moderate generation. They grew up in a time in which there wasn't all of this social media, and so they grew up with kind of normal media. And I think that would be an excellent generational change. The question is whether it gets to Gen X or whether the baton goes straight from the boomers to their kids, which is Gen Z, because Gen X is a very small generation. It doesn't have nearly as much power and it doesn't have nearly as much bulk. Gen Z is having a lot of trouble. As you might know if you saw Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, we have a sky-high epidemic of mental health challenges and so on in this younger generation, in part because they were raised with real helicopter parenting and social media at the same time, and that 1-2 punch of not really being allowed to develop the social skills and being able to talk across difference and deal with different people, and having social media seems to have been really problematic for them. So my hope is that we can pass the baton to Gen X, which would be the natural next generation, get some sensible, moderate leadership, and give Gen Z some time to work themselves out and sort of deal with some of these problems of growing up. The problem would be if it goes straight on, and then we might see even more polarization, because that's a quite polarized generation.
Great, all very important points. Next round of questions.
So how should Japan respond to a divided America?
I think not just Japan, but in an earlier conversation or panel here today, people were talking about the role. Was it Richard Edelman this morning? Maybe talking about the role, the importance of business executives talking to their counterparts about the need to create some kind of new narratives about our society. You know, try and create a healthier understanding of what we are and what we're about and what we're trying to accomplish. Richard gave a bunch of data points this morning, including the fact that people trust their employers more than they trust the government and more than they trust each other, which I think means that companies employers and companies have a role to play in making sure their employees are getting good information and understand how society works. And I don't know. I think many companies would be reluctant to do that, but I know there's a startup in Washington, D.C., and it's working already with a couple big consulting firms, and they basically deliver news in a sort of format that the overlords of the company have approved. They deliver news over the company intranet to the employees, because the company wants to make sure that its employees are getting accurate and factual information, and they know that the employees believe it if it's coming from them, the employers. And a lot of the news is about their industry, but they filter in other news about the world. And I think we all have an obligation to kind of step up and make sure the next generations that Rachel was talking about, you know, have some hope and feel like they understand why the economy is structured the way it's structured, how our democracy is meant to work and what it's meant to accomplish. I don't know that one country, I don't know that Japan or any other country can, you know, counsel the U.S. or people in the U.S. how to run their society. I don't think that'll generate a good response.
Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, we need to prevent Japan to be divided. And good news is last year, Smart News, think tank, Smart News Media Institute conducted a survey like what Pew Research Center did in the US. The Pew Research Center started the survey of political polarization from 1994. And then, there's a maybe 30-year survey. But in Japan, there is no such a survey, and we started the survey last year. The result was good news. So there is no signs of the strong political polarization in Japan. But as you know, this kind of social media is a global phenomena. And so social media and conspiracy theory on the social media is like a virus. And it's not a domestic problem, it's a global problem. So we need to prevent jointly this kind of phenomena. So as I said, we should help the US government to regulate the social media like 4channel, which is operated by a Japanese company and the Japanese owner. And at the same time, maybe we need support from US government to regulate Meta's as fraud problem in Japan. It's becoming a huge problem in Japan. So I think maybe regulating the social media is a kind of joint issue, the common issue of the both countries.
Rachel, maybe I'll add more of an international dimension to this question, and we don't have to be Samuel Huntington to know that democracy is moving in waves and in groups, and democratic backsliding also. In one country's democratic backsliding affects other countries, especially a big country like the United States. What can Japan do to prevent this spread or stop the democratic backsliding in the world, especially in Asia?
So I think telling a story is a really important part of this. I was at a pre-meeting for this year's Summit for Democracy. This is Biden's initiative to bring the democracies together. And this coming year, it will be held in person, or it has been held at this point, in person at the Republic of Korea. But before that meeting, a number of us were getting together to talk about it. And the representative from the Republic of Korea told a really interesting story, which I think is also one that Japan could tell and that more countries need to tell. And what this was China is telling a story that economic growth comes from a strong leader dictating policy. And that story is gaining a lot of ground among a lot of developing countries that see the chaos they perceive in democracies, partially true, partially media picked and chosen, and they don't want that, and they would rather have a growth while they can control it and possibly get some of the gain for themselves. The Korean representative to the Summit for Democracy said, look, we did progress economically a certain extent under our dictatorship. That's true. However, for a creative economy, for the next leap economically, we really needed a democracy. We couldn't have made it past this sort of first level of economic growth without the freedom and openness that came from democracy. And I thought that was a very compelling story. It's an important one for countries to start telling, because so much of the world is looking for economic growth more than they're looking sometimes for freedom. They want some stability and some growth. And so tying these things together is useful. It's also true. I've been looking and helping the Bertelsmann Transformation Index on all of their numbers, and the findings on how much democracy helps countries are really irrefutable, but they're just not getting out. And Japan, I think, can do a great job of helping us tell that global story.
Great, thank you. Wonderful note to end on this very insightful and somewhat hopeful, uplifting session. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.